Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our December 2nd Friday Forum. As it turns out, this is our last Friday Forum for the semester. My name is Deborah Seiler. I'm your Renaissance president, and I'm so pleased to present to you today with State Senator Ben Allen, what's happening in California's environmental legislation. Ben represents California's 26th State Senate District. This includes Hollywood, Westside, Santa Monica, and coastal South Bay communities in Los Angeles County. Ben currently chairs the Senate Environmental Quality Committee and the Legislature's Environmental Caucus. Ben stayed with us, my husband Jim and I, during his second year in the legislature, and he also at that time was chairing the Senate Elections Committee. So we had many, many fine conversations about California elections at that time. Jim and I always joked that Ben may be a little overqualified for the California state legislature. He got his bachelor's degree from Harvard, his master's degree from the University of Cambridge in the UK, and a law degree from UC Berkeley. He has worked tirelessly, and we observed this firsthand. He's worked tirelessly to address the impacts of plastics pollution and climate change. He has also worked to bolster our state's climate resiliency amid increasing risks of wildfires, droughts, and sea level rise. He was a featured guest speaker at our Renaissance Society summer program in 2021. We are tremendously fortunate today to have Ben provide an informative roundup of the most crucial environmental legislation of 2022. Thank you, Ben.
Well, thank you so much, Deb. It's so good to see you, and I look forward to seeing you and Jim soon with the swearing in, and then of course the new session starting in January. It's lovely to see everybody. I've got a little PowerPoint presentation that let me try to figure out how to set up here for everyone. But let me also just start by congratulating. I know the Sac State is doing an incredible job on multiple levels, including its football team. So I just got word that they were undefeated this year, and that's really cool for anyone who's associated with the university and the team. This is an opportunity for me to just have a chat with you about environmental policy. It's something I know that's near and dear to Deb and Jim's heart, and we talk so much about these issues, and it's been wonderful having the opportunity to serve as chair of the committee that oversees our state's environmental policy, the Environmental Quality Committee. I'm actually, before I start with the presentation, though, I'll tell you a little funny thing about where I am right now. I'm in LAX. I just got off an airplane, having been at a conference in Washington, and right behind me you can see the plans for the new People Mover. So if any of you ever end up flying into LA, within a few years, you'll be able to take a train from the terminals that'll connect you right up to the metro and the parking and the park and ride and all the different terminals. So they're finally going to make LAX a bit of a much more credible international airport. So here's our PowerPoint, and I'm just going to get going on it. So we're really what I'm so excited about is the fact that we were able to move the needle on a number of really great bills that seek to protect air and water in our state. Of course, in the past couple of years, due to the budget surpluses that we've experienced, we've also been able to secure some great one-time funding opportunities to reduce wildfires and drought and improve community resiliency. So there's a lot to celebrate and a lot to talk about this year. But I will say we've been working for a long time to try to make progress on environmental issues in the state, in spite of massive Democratic majorities. One of my constant sources of frustration, and I know it's Deb and Jim's too, we talked about it quite a bit, was how little we'd been able to accomplish as Democrats in the legislature until this last year. It really, truly was 2022 truly was a banner year for the environment. We took on several really big issues. We saw a great deal of success, and I'm just going to spend a little time today talking about a handful of key policy areas where we really moved the needle, including the momentous climate change package, electric vehicles and energy policies. And then, of course, SB54, our landmark plastics and packaging measure that I had the chance to talk to you about earlier before it passed, of course. And so I'm just proud to announce that we were finally able to get that across the finish line. So, through my chairmanship of the Environmental Quality Committee and also service on the Natural Resources and Water Committee, I've had the opportunity to work on basically all of the environmental policy that comes through the Senate. I'm as I say, I'm excited about what we've been able to accomplish. There's still a lot more to do, but let's talk about some of the successes. This year, the Senate organized a climate working group to tackle some of the thorniest issues that had been stalling movement of good policy in recent years. We worked to develop solutions that would reduce emissions while also protecting communities and ensuring good paying jobs. We included a very diverse set of senators in the climate working group to ensure that all voices would be heard. And through that work, and also through rigorous negotiations with the Assembly and the governor, we crafted a climate package that put California back at the front of the national conversation and to some extent the global conversation, or at least with some of the global leaders, focusing on ensuring that as we ratchet down emissions, we also protect workers and vulnerable communities. And there was a very strong conversation within the working group about equity and social justice and those kinds of issues. So my committee staff, the staff of the Environmental Quality Committee, was intimately involved with the drafting and finalizing of several of the key bills that we're going to highlight here today. Cumulatively, these measures are going to require the state to become carbon neutral by 2045, require the state to produce 90% of its electricity from clean sources by 2035, ramping up to 100% by 2045. One other bill will create safety zones around oil wells near homes, schools, and other sensitive sites. Folks may have seen that City of Los Angeles took some additional aggressive action along those lines just today at the City Council. The package also is going to require the state to draft rules to fast track the permitting of technology that aims to safely remove carbon from the air as we steadily reduce carbon emissions. And this aggressive package, combined with a record $54 billion of investment in climate action, will create 4 million new jobs, cut air pollution by 60%, reduce state oil consumption by 91% if it meets its goals that we have, save California $23 billion by avoiding the damages of pollution, and reduce fossil fuel use in buildings and transportation and refinery pollution by very high amounts. So let's go through some of the bills so that folks can be familiar with them. First of all, there's AB 1279, carbon neutrality. It was Al Marsucci's bill, my colleague from the South Bay here in Los Angeles. And this bill codifies the statewide carbon neutrality goal to dramatically reduce climate pollution. It establishes a clear, legally binding, and achievable goal for California to achieve statewide carbon neutrality as soon as possible, but no later than 2045. And it establishes an 85% emissions reduction target as part of that goal. Al had been working on this issue for a number of years. This bill, a similar bill, had come very close to passage in the Senate the year before, and I was just glad that we were able to, with the support of the governor and leadership, finally get that across the finish line. SB 1137, controversial, very interesting bill done by my colleagues Lena Gonzalez and Monique Limon. Lena is from Long Beach and Monique is from Santa Barbara. They're both members of the Latino Caucus. And this bill protects communities from the harmful impacts of oil extracting and oil drilling. This bill aims to reduce oil and gas pollution that is oftentimes found very close to poor communities that disproportionately bear the brunt of the health impacts associated with oil extraction. There's a lot of pollution associated with extraction. This bill establishes a setback distance of 3,200 feet between any new oil well and homes, schools, parks, or businesses that are generally open to the public. And it ensures comprehensive pollution controls for existing oil wells within 3,200 feet of these facilities. So the idea is we don't want to be opening new wells that are close to where people live, close to where kids go to school or play in parks, because we know how much pollution is associated. And I think this photograph here in the corner kind of is an interesting example of what we end up having. A lot of our disadvantaged kids, we have them playing sports and going to school, living next to oil fields, and this is not good for their health. So that's it. That's SB 1137. We were finally able to get that across the finish line too. Once again, an effort that took several years to pass. SB 1020 was the centerpiece workhorse bill of the climate working group. It's Senator Laird's bill. This is John Laird from Santa Cruz, and it was really the combined product of our work group's work. And it's the 100% Clean Energy Jobs and Affordability Act of 2022. It creates clean energy targets of 90% by 2035 and 95% by 2040, with the intent of advancing the state's trajectory to the existing goal of 100% clean electricity retail sales by 2045. I mentioned it as part of the highlights at the beginning. The bill also requires all state agencies to source their energy from 100% renewable sources by 2035, which was 10 years sooner than law had required before, so that it sped up the clean energy, renewable sourcing rules. Two more bills, that I want to talk about. These are complicated bills relating to carbon capture. So first of all, SB 905 and then SB 1113. So these bills were ultimately focused on trying to take advantage of federal policy and funding that seeks to advance engineered technologies to remove carbon pollution, while banning the use of these technologies for enhanced oil recovery, which was the main concern associated with carbon capture on the environmental side. So, just like this chart shows, there is a technique that has been developed to basically capture CO2 emissions as they're being emitted from stationary or even mobile sources, and then pumped underground so as not to have the carbon go up into the atmosphere, and oftentimes pumped underground into existing oil fields, or at least oil fields that have been depleted. It's controversial, but it's been found in some cases to be a good tool for removing carbon from the air, so it's not contributing to the greenhouse gas problem that we have, and it also does ultimately provide some use for these oil wells that have been, the oil has been extracted, and now they need something to put down there. Of course, one of the controversies that continued to dog this issue was whether this could be used as a stalking horse for more oil extraction, enhanced oil recovery, fracking, et cetera. And we put in language to ensure that that would not be the case. The bill does establish a clear regulatory framework for carbon removal and carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. Ultimately, the key goal here was to ensure that this technology could reduce emissions without worsening air quality for local communities. And to that end, it bans the practice of injecting carbon dioxide, carbon capture, as I said, for the purpose of enhanced oil recovery, because we didn't want to see carbon capture technologies used to simply pump more oil out of the ground. This is something that was part of the Infrastructure Act and some of the other work coming out of Washington, D.C., and we'll be able to take advantage of some federal money to help to finance this. So these are the two bills on the topic. And Monique Limon, you can see here, SB 1314, had been skeptical of carbon capture, and I think her bill put in place some really important protections so as to ensure that it really does focus on its stated goals as a carbon reduction mechanism. Let's go to the next slide here. Let's see. This is a great bill, SB 1757, nature-based solutions. It enlists nature in the state's climate agenda. It requires the state to develop an achievable carbon removal target for natural and working lands by 2024. And it also updates the natural and working lands climate smart strategy for the state to achieve the natural carbon sequestration targets that we have by 2025. So what are natural climate solutions? Well, conservation, restoration, improved land management actions that increase carbon storage or avoid greenhouse gas emissions. And this includes more parks and greenways, trees in all communities, protecting wetlands and our waterways, improving farming and ranching practices, across the state. Natural climate solutions offer some of our best options in response to climate change, and of course, they're natural. And so we're trying to. It's all about trying to help the Earth help itself, heal itself. We've also been spending time focused on electric vehicles. We know that part of the task ahead involves a transition to cleaner burning vehicles and an electrification ultimately of our fleet. So we've got these zero emission vehicles bills that have been making their way through the legislature. California's set a mandate that all new car sales have to be zero emission by 2035. This year, the legislature took significant strides to try to get us to this very ambitious goal. It's going to be a difficult goal to meet. So first of all, we knew we needed to include investment in the budget to fund critical infrastructure and help low-income Californians also get into cleaner cars. So this isn't just a rich person thing. So $10 billion in investment in that space. We also passed a suite of measures to complement this funding. So there's AB 2622, which is Kevin Mullins' bill. Kevin's about to go off to Congress, actually. He just got elected from the Silicon Valley area. This bill extends sales tax exemptions for transit buses. SB 1251, Lena's bill, creating a ZEV market development office and a ZEV equity advocate. Nancy Skinner from Oakland, Berkeley, authored SB 1010, which accelerates the deployment of these zero emissions vehicles in the state fleet. So the state-owned automobile fleet, by giving contracting preferences for rental vehicles to those companies with more ZEVs, with more of these zero emissions vehicles. AB 2836, Eddie Garcia's bill. Eddie's from Salton Sea area. This bill extends the very popular Carl Moyer funding program, which has for decades provided critical incentives for businesses to move to cleaner trucks and heavy equipment. And then Phil Ting from San Francisco provides his bill, AB 2061, provides continued support for reliable ZEV chargers and other infrastructure through better record keeping and reporting standards. There are other key measures to mention. I guess the one that I want to just point out is Senator Josh Becker's SB 1203. On top of the economy-wide net zero goal, this bill directs our state government agencies to start planning for how to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2035, or as soon as possible thereafter from their own operations. So this means, decarbonizing state buildings and transitioning state vehicle fleets to ZEVs and more. This is a full 10 years ahead of the economy-wide goal, meaning the government of California itself is going to help forge the path toward a decarbonized economy. Now, let me just take a moment to talk a little bit about SB54, which is a bill that I'm really proud of. This was our plastics bill. It was a multi-year effort. It really started with China's sword. This was where China's national sword policy was put into place in 2017. This was a decision by the Chinese government to stop taking on plastic waste from other countries, including the United States. We used to just ship our waste off to China, and so much of it ended up incinerated, ended up in landfills, ended up in oceans and riverways, polluting communities. And the Chinese said, enough is enough. We don't need this anymore. We're not taking your crap anymore. And it really forced a major rethink in our state. And in fact, in many parts of the country, it used to be that local governments actually used to make money off of recycling material. LA used to get about $5 million a year from selling its recycled material. Now it's losing $1 million just to meet the basic diversion rates. And a lot of this has to do with the contamination of the system, the dysfunction of the system, et cetera. And so, with this having passed, with National Sword having come down, we quickly lacked a sufficient recycling infrastructure while also having more plastic waste piling up than ever before. All that stuff that used to go off to China, all of a sudden we had to find something to do with it. And this led to some dramatic increases to local governments to handle material. And it was really starting to become a crisis. It was eating into funds for cops and parks. It also was leading to rate increases for regular folks. I know County of Sacramento just raised the rates for waste hauling, waste collection by $10 a month. not too long ago. And it was really clear to me, and I think those of us who are working in this space, that one-off solutions like straws on demand would not be enough. We ultimately needed a larger framework to tackle the crisis. So we first introduced SB54 in December 2018 with the goal of developing that comprehensive framework. And after 4 years of intense negotiation with stakeholders, the introduction of a citizen-led ballot measure, several iterations of our policy, we finally got the bill across the finish line this past June, and it truly got international attention. But it was a long process, and we had some pretty tough end of session defeats that left us despondent. Let me just let's talk about it. Let's talk about the bill. Let me tell you a little about the scope of the bill. So first of all, the bill looks at all single-use packaging. It's material neutral. So it actually doesn't just include plastics. It includes other products, paper, glass, and aluminum. But it also includes plastic single-use food serviceware. But ultimately, the focus is really on plastic. It was important for us to include the other products in the bill for collection purposes to make the system work more coherently. And I can talk about this in more detail if people want to get into it. But it was important for us to include all the major products. But ultimately, plastics was at the heart of this bill. And the bill ultimately has three key policy pillars. First of all, reducing the amount of single-use plastic on the market, ensuring all covered materials that actually ends up on the market, all the covered materials that end up on the market be sustainable, and then shifting the financial burden from taxpayers, where it currently sits, to producers through extended producer responsibility. So let's dig into that a little bit. Like, why is it that it's appropriate for producers to take more responsibility, to ultimately take responsibility for this material? So if you think about it, it's the producers who decide if shampoo, for example, is sold in a bottle that's readily recyclable or not. Additionally, it's the producers of these bottles that decide whether or not to manufacture the container of an item with cheap virgin plastics or post-consumer resins. I mean, in nearly every case, for reasons that I think are obvious, producers are opting for the cheaper option because plastic, the virgin plastic is just so inexpensive. But as a result, we're all paying the price because of this glut of virgin plastic that continues to push out into the market. And because the producers are opting for the cheap option, there's no market for recycled material, right? If they actually were to focus on trying to incorporate post-consumer resins into their products, there would be more of a market for recycled material, which would then grow the recycling system. So our bill steps into the breach, and it requires packaging to achieve high recycling rates. And as a result, producers are going to take action to pursue more sustainable alternatives. I'll just give you one example. I mean, some of Jim Hodges, my dear friend, grew up in LA, just like me. And in the 1970s, LA had horrible air quality. It was so bad you often couldn't see the Hollywood sign. Some kids were growing up in parts of town with half of the lung capacity compared to kids in rural parts of the country. And, there actually was a decent portion of the automobile industry that was trying to utilize technologies that would lower smog, but many were content with the status quo. And ultimately those automobile manufacturers that were trying to do the right thing were not incentivized to do the right thing by policy. They were just doing it because they knew it was the right thing to do, but it actually sometimes would harm them on the market. So government said, enough is enough. This is crazy. We have to have a better system. We have to take steps to protect our air. And the government worked together with industry to put in place fair rules around the emissions outputs of cars. And today we see, we have a lot more traffic on the road in Los Angeles, but the air is significantly cleaner, even though there's many more cars on the road. And this has not only impacted air quality in LA, it's transformed the global market. As I say, there's still lots of air pollution being caused by cars, partly because we have so many more cars. But individual cars produce significantly less pollution today than they did before. And that's because California said enough is enough. We have to do this. We have to push. And And of course, we all know the automobile industry, kicked and screamed for a while, but in the end of the day, they knew they could do this. And I say all of this to highlight how these kinds of requirements can protect public health and our environment while also cultivating the kinds of technological advancements that have kept California as the global leader in innovation. So similarly, with that same logic, SB54 pushes producers to invest in a robust reuse and refill infrastructure, shift from material types that can't be recycled, meaning they are destined for the landfill or an incinerator or lost to the environment. And then ultimately to build the market for post-consumer content that will also boost collection efforts, keeping this material out of our oceans and out of our communities and out of our landfills. Our goal is to create the infrastructure and push companies to make sustainable materials so that consumers don't have to think twice when standing in their kitchens trying to determine if something should go into the blue bin or into the trash. I mean, Consumer Brands performed a study on recycling. They found that for many Americans, recycling ranks ahead of some of the most confusing things in life. It's one of the most confusing things to do. It's more confusing than building IKEA furniture, more confusing than doing your taxes, more confusing than playing the stock market, or even understanding your spouse. So, and this crazy system where we rely on good nature, good, well-intentioned people to be the ones to make the system work functionally, as opposed to getting the producers involved, was so backwards. And we're finally getting the producers involved and forcing them to take recyclability into account and take the end use into account. Okay, so to achieve our policy pillars, this new program has 4 key components of source reduction, requirement that all material be recyclable or compostable with rates and dates, creation of a producer responsibility organization, and then fees and funding. So let's go through these 4 key elements. First of all, source reduction. It's the hardest part of the negotiations. It's never been done before. I mean, besides, of course, just bans. And this area is plastics only. So we said we just want less plastic source pushed out into the market. How do we negotiate that? Well, we created this 25% reduction mandate. 10% of this has to come from reuse or refill, or just eliminating plastic altogether. With some aggressive interim targets that you can see here on the slide: 10% by 2027, with 2% from reuse and refill; 20% by 2030, with 4% from reuse and refill. And then the rest is source reduction. What does that mean? Well, we want products. We want them the producers to start optimizing, lightweighting, concentrating, shifting to another packaging type. And we know what we're talking about here. This crazy amount of plastic that sometimes, I mean, this is a little picture here of avocado halves. I mean, how crazy? They cut the avocado for you, and then put it in a massive box of plastic. I mean, this is modern America, right? So the great thing about fruit and vegetables, oftentimes they come in a natural packaging, and yet somehow we decide we need to cut it up and then cover it in plastic. So this is crazy. We need to reduce the amount of plastics that are just being pushed out. And so we did, as I mentioned before, this bill was ultimately the product of a pretty serious negotiation with the industry. And in fact, the Chamber of Commerce ultimately signed off on the deal so as to avoid going to the ballot. And so, we did make some concessions. So for example, using recycled content is considered an alternative compliance. It's capped at 8%, but we did want to encourage the use of recycled content. And it is a form of source reduction, right? Because you are ultimately taking material that would otherwise be going out to the landfill and creating more of a market for recycled content. So we were fine with making that concession. Sustainable packaging. It's an important part of the bill too. This was, so basically, we did a bill a couple of years ago that we talked about at the last Renaissance meeting where we basically said, look, you can't put the recycled material symbol, the chasing arrow symbol, on an item that's not really recyclable. If it's heading straight to the landfill in real life, just because it may be recyclable under perfect conditions in a lab at 1,000 degrees in Salt Lake City, doesn't mean that we want people putting this item in the blue bin when we all know that it's not getting recycled in the real world. So if you don't meet the definition of SB343, the bill that I talked about, then if you can't put if you're not really recyclable, then you shouldn't be able to use the chasing arrow symbol. Similarly, we have a similar thing under another bill, AB 1201, for compostability. So just because something is technically compostable under the perfect conditions. It doesn't mean that we want people putting those items in the composting bin unless it's actually compostable under real world conditions. And so we basically wanted to have their aggressive dates and rates under a 1201, the compostable, basically the compost, basically you have to be accepted by compostable facilities. So what we said in our bill in SB54 is that we want 30% compostability or recyclability by 2028, 40% by 2030, 65% by 2032. So aggressive rates that continue to increase to require industry to start producing better products that are actually going to get recycled, actually going to get composted, and not just gum up the system. We also had special language associated with extended polystyrene. This is styrofoam. We didn't ban styrofoam under the bill, but we required styrofoam, extended polystyrene EPS, to meet an earlier performance standard. So 25% recycling rate by 2025. And I'll say their recycling rate now is so low that it would take an absolute miracle for them to meet that rate. Obviously it would be great if they did, but it's hard to imagine them meeting that rate, in which case we're going to see a phase out of polystyrene foodware. We create these producer responsibility organizations, that will help to manage the system. First, there'll be one big producer responsibility organization, and then there's a plan and a budget that they have to produce. It's reviewed by an advisory board. It's approved by CalRecycle. There's annual reports. It has to be updated. The budget has to fully cover the cost to comply and fully cover the cost to local government and haulers. We put in place, one of the things that was controversial. A lot of folks say, well, how is it that you're putting business in charge of regulating themselves, of running the system? Let me put it that way. Well, we did think that yes, business ought to be in charge of. They know their products best. They know their consumers best. They know their markets best. So to the extent that we put them in the driver's seat to meet those rates and dates for recyclability, compostability, source reduction, I think that's appropriate. But the key thing here is that we, at the same time, we hold them accountable to those rates and dates, aggressively accountable. And that is ultimately done through this oversight mechanism with CalRecycle, which is the department that oversees this area. They have all of these oversight mechanisms that they have to, they approve the PRO, they approve the plan, they conduct a needs assessment. They publish a list of materials that can would meet the recyclability and compostability rates. There's an advisory board. So there's all sorts of oversight mechanisms that we built into the bill that made the environmental community feel comfortable. And we also had really strong enforcement, very high penalties, $50,000 per day per violation per product. There is, of course, but at the end of the day, we would much rather people comply than have to be punitive. And so in the end of the day, we created a mechanism for a corrective action plan where an entity that might be in violation can submit a plan. But we also said that CalRecycle, if there's one of these organizations that's just totally out of compliance, we allow them to revoke the organization's right to exist under this scheme. And this is the first time it's ever happened before. One of the things we learned from previous extended producer responsibility systems, they were too weak, and they didn't give CalRecycle, they didn't give the department enough power to hold the folks that were running the system accountable. So we learned from that mistake and incorporated some pretty tough enforcement and accountability measures. And then we also have a fee system. The fees have basically it's to cover costs, cost to pull the material through the system, administrative costs of the organization and CalRecycle. The fees are actually eco-modulated. So we want to encourage better, more environmentally friendly products. So you pay a higher fee if you're not easy to recycle or compost, if you don't use post-consumer content, if you don't take good efforts to source reduce, if you don't standardize packaging, if you have hazardous materials, if you don't properly label. Conversely, if you do those things, you pay a lower fee, because we're trying to encourage better, more pro-social, more functional behavior for the system to work better. And then along with these fees, it also includes a mitigation fee that's a big, going to produce a lot of money to help to mitigate the environmental and public health impacts of plastic, with a real focus on low income and disadvantaged communities. $350 million the funding is going to come from the producers, $150 million coming from the plastics resins manufacturers. I put this picture here because I just want to underscore to people how much real damage this product continues to cause for our environment. And the producers have had literally no responsibility associated with the end use and all the damage caused. And so this is a way to mitigate. So I'm really proud of the work that we got done. I mean, ultimately, of course, success can only be measured on whether or not the model can be exported. One of the things I said over and over again through this process was if this was something that only that only took place here in California, I would feel this whole thing to be a failure. I want to make sure that this has an impact all over the world, and we're already seeing people step up. I mean, we've already been getting phone calls from both distributors and producers who've been meaning to move toward more sustainable packaging for years because they knew it was the right thing to do, but now they really have to. Now they're going to be pushed to, and they're starting to take steps in that direction. So for me, it's an example of a cost-effective, thoughtful way for us to move industry in the direction that I think they already knew they needed to move in. And as they say, this was the product of a negotiated deal struck between the chamber, the environmental community, local governments, haulers, environmental justice folks. It was a very delicate balance because there had been this ballot measure that had qualified for the ballot, and in the end of the day, they basically had to make a decision as to whether they wanted to fight this out at the ballot box, which they probably could have won, the industry folks, but it would have cost them a ton of money, and they also would have they knew that we would be right back at square one next year fighting this again, or they could sit down at the table with us, figure out a system together for us to actually solve this problem. And I'm just so glad that we were able to get there. And I in the photo there, holding up the bill is Tina Andalina, our great staffer who really jockeyed all these negotiations. And did such a good job making this such a success. And she, just above, you see our votes. We ultimately got a lot of Republican support. It certainly wasn't unanimous, but lots of Republican support because I think they recognize how hard we'd work to try to bring folks together. So anyway, with that, that's a little overview of the environmental successes of the year, but also a big deep dive into what we were able to do with plastics. And I'd love to open up the floor to questions. Happy to answer any questions anyone may have. I'm actually heading off, in a couple. I'm happy to talk about COP, happy to talk about climate change, and also about politics. So let me close with that.
Thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate your encyclopedic overview of everything that you and the rest of the legislators are working on. Probably want to take a breath and hydrate here at some point because that was a lot of information. Thank you so much. One of the first questions is, what changed in 2022 that you said this was a landmark year for getting all of these kinds of things in front of the legislature and actually passed? What changed?
It's a great question. I think part of it, quite frankly, is the governor's national ambitions have grown, and I think I think that the government had taken some what I think very justified criticism for really not acting aggressively enough on a lot of these big environmental issues. We'd had all sorts of major successes on other things that are near and dear to Democratic activists' hearts, but this was an area where we made so little progress, and I think the governor realized that we needed to do better and started to actually put his own shoulder to the wheel a little bit, and it was so gratifying for those of us that have been working on this stuff for quite some time to finally have his full-throated support and energy. In the case of the ballot measure, the case of the plastics, it really was, as I say, we just hadn't had that support from on high. I mean, the governor had said he was supportive. Our legislative leadership had said they were supportive, but ultimately, time and time again, they hadn't really been willing to do enough to push us over, to help get us over the finish line. And that's why a bunch of activists finally said, to heck with this, that we don't think the legislature is ever going to act. We're just going to try to qualify a measure for the ballot. that created the impetus for the negotiation that eventually led to our passage of the bill. So it was a good example of the use. People complain about the ballot measure system, and there's lots to complain about, but it was a good example of the use of the ballot measure system to force a negotiated deal. Gerald Steinberg implemented this when he was pro tem of the Senate. It was a very, very wise thing that he did. It used to be that when ballot measure would qualify for the ballot, it just meant it was going to go to the ballot regardless of whether we could address the issues or not. Now there's a new mechanism that allows the signatories of the ballot measure to pull the measure back if they feel as though the legislature has acted adequately to address the issue that they were trying to address through their ballot measure. And that's what we were able to do here. Sometimes we do strike a deal, we're able to, sometimes we're not. And that's why you continue to see things like dialysis on your ballot. I don't think we're ever going to strike a deal on that because the two sides are just so far off. But at least in this area, we were able to bring people together and basically save all of you from $100 million onslaught of ads relating to plastics.
Okay, it makes sense. Does CalRecycle have any kind of thoughts about putting together a robust public service announcement program to educate us better about recycling any of these things? Because it's always confusing as heck to me, and I therefore then throw up my hands and say, I don't know what to do.
Yeah. Yes. That's and in fact, there's funding for that that built in some of those the fee structure I was talking about. They know they need to. They know this is going to be a really important part of the story. But I will say, Christy, that part of the idea here is that we're not going to have to engage, right? In a weird way, we have to engage in more public education now than we will when the bill is fully implemented. Because right now, we leave almost every critical decision up to the consumer, who of course is the least well prepared to handle, to handle that decision. Going forward, we're telling the producers, if it's not recyclable or compostable, you're not going to get compostability or recyclability credit, and you got to phase it out. So, so there will be more coherence imposed, systemically, so as to make your life easier, so you don't have to sit there in front of the blue bin deciding which item ought to go in, which item ought not.
Oh, that's a relief. So what about having enough charging stations for all the electrical cars, which we don't have enough even close to right now?
Yeah, not even close. And by the way, we also don't have enough electrical capacity, at least under the current functioning of the grid. So there's a major amount of money in the budget this year to help to build out that charging infrastructure. That actually was one of the real controversies in the whole debate over Proposition 30. And one of the points the governor made was that we all know governor, of course, opposed Proposition 30. One of his big arguments was that he had committed and is continued to be very committed to major budgetary investments in the charging infrastructure and just building out the stations. So there's a lot of money in the budget for that effort and incentives as well. Of course, we're also going to have to really improve our grid and make it a smarter grid. There's actually a lot of electrical capacity, but we have to be smarter about the way that the ways and the whens of our electrical use. There are certain times of the day, and especially as our solar capacity continues to grow, there are certain times of the day when there's an excess of electricity, and other times of the day when we're really taxing the system. Usually it's when people get usually the period from 5 to 8, especially on a hot summer's day. People come home, they crank up the AC, the sun's coming down, so there's less solar being produced, and all of a sudden there's all this energy use. And yet, maybe 12 noon on a sunny day that's not very hot, there's just so much electricity being produced and not utilized. So can we figure out a smarter grid? Can we figure out and there's some technology being developed already to basically focus our electrical use on there's certain types of things like charging, for example. Let's say sometimes, I have an electric car. There are some days where I'm driving it all day. There's other days it just sits there plugged into my house all day. So on days like that, I could, if we had, there's technology being developed that would focus the charging of our cars during those periods of time where we have excess solar power being produced. But this is an enormous issue. I think, of course, all I would say is, who would have imagined that, we'd all be carrying more computing power than the spaceship that brought the first man to the moon in our pockets, every single one of us. So, we know that by 2035, if you think about all the advances that have been made in the last, 13 years, what the world looked like, what technology looked like 13 years ago, we can only imagine that there will be a lot of advances by 2035. And a lot of the work is already underway. We know in many cases, we're very capable of it. It's logistics, it's funding, it's scaling. And it's a big effort. And it's one we're well aware of. And the Air Resources Board and the governor are pretty committed to putting in the investments to ensure that we have the infrastructure necessary.
Okay, sounds good. So what about pumping the CO2 into the empty oil wells? Is there a downside to that? So what's the cost benefit analysis of having that process in place?
Yeah. So, the biggest environmental concern has been that this be used as a stalking horse. It's just a way to keep, enhanced oil recovery continuing. I guess there are people who worry about leaks, right? I mean, that's something I'm a little concerned about, quite frankly. I think it's untested technology in many respects. That being said, they've been doing this in Iceland and elsewhere. And so far it's been going well. I think, honestly, my big concern is that I think it overpromises and underdelivers as a climate solution. But there are a lot of people in industry and in labor who really want this. And my attitude is, if the federal government's willing to pay for it, and it's a big, and it helps keep, I will say, part of our challenge throughout all this has been, how do we ensure a just transition for people working in the oil industry? There's a lot of people who have been working their whole lives, in oil. California is a major oil production state. And, they've negotiated really good collective bargaining agreements for themselves through their unions and their members. And this is one way to do something that would have, a small but not insignificant helpful impact on climate, while also giving them work to do as we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. So, from my perspective, this is not the panacea. It's not going to solve all the problems. But I do see this as a modestly helpful thing. And of course, going back to my last point, it's possible, as we continue to work in this space, that the scientists and engineers will come up with technologies and techniques that will make it significantly more effective as a climate greenhouse gas reduction tool. But the idea ultimately is you basically filter out, as our factories are spewing out carbon, you put in place filters that can capture a significant portion of the carbon, and then you store it somewhere. From my perspective, we should reduce the amount of carbon that we keep spewing out. But if we're going to continue spewing it out, I'm all for capturing and sequestering some of that. So it's from my perspective, it's better sequestered than in the air, exacerbating our climate problems.
So it was a great little graphic you had of how it's taken out of the air, but to be more specific, is it a giant vacuum cleaner, or how is it actually removing carbon from the air?
It's like a filter. It's basically the best way to describe it is a filter. I'm sure there's somebody on this call here who's an engineer who could give a much more detailed answer, but that's the simplest way of thinking of it.
Okay. A couple people have mentioned that Oregon has a great cans and bottle recycling program, primarily because they give a better reimbursement.
Yeah.
Is California on any kind of path to do that and encourage people even more so?
Yeah. So we know, so I'm a big fan of the Oregon model for their bottle bill. And we've now included wine, into our bottle bill in California. But from my perspective, we really do need to up the amount of money that is given, the reimbursable. And that's something I certainly want to work on. I will say that SB54 will help systemically address many of the issues that that the Oregon bill helps to address. But we actually went up there a couple times and learned from their model. We want to cooperate with them. I'd like to expand upon our existing bottle bill, and that's a discussion that is underway right now. By the way, another cool thing that Oregon does that we've run a bill to help to facilitate is they've got a whole group of beer manufacturers have gotten together and decided to standardize their bottles. So they slap their own label on, but the bottle itself is physically the same. So as a result, they're able to, wash the bottles many, many times perfectly safely, as opposed to having to collect it, break it down, turn it into a new bottle, having heated it up at an enormous cost and energy cost. And it's a system that works really well. We're trying to encourage that here in California. It's so cool. I mean, a couple environmentally oriented wine companies have actually joined in on the fund and are now producing wine in the beer bottles. And in a funny way, it's actually been incredibly popular because sometimes people don't want to drink a whole bottle of wine. They like drinking just, a beer bottle's worth of wine in an evening as opposed to a full wine bottle. And it's also allowed them to participate in the program too.
How about that?
I like to see that expand in California.
Great. So we have, that's it. That's about all the Zoom questions we have time for. I'm going to toss it back to the actual campus room at Sac State, see if there's anybody in that room that has any questions. And if not, we'll be wrapping this up real soon. Thank you so much, Senator. This was extremely powerful.
Thank you, Christy. Hold on.
I'm just wondering, because EVs are so expensive, will there be any kind of subsidy program for those of us that are ancient as hell and living on Social Security?
Yeah, I mean, there's an absolute recognition. So there's already a robust subsidy, but it needs to grow. And I also think we need to continue to expand the used EV market. I actually bought we have two EVs that we bought used because they're much more affordable. And a lot of people don't even think of that as an option. And of course, as the range continues to grow, I think there will be more interest in the used market. But your point's well taken. I think everybody recognizes that there's an equity issue here. At least so far, EVs have been something that the wealthiest are able to take advantage of, and it's not been adequate. It's not, we haven't adequately democratized access. So there is a lot of work underway to try to expand, affordability incentives, both in the used and the new market. And that's something that CARB, the Air Resources Board that's spearheading this effort, have been working on quite a bit.
If there are no other questions from the audience here, Ben, I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One is, prior to the pandemic, grocery stores were moving away from single-use plastic bags. With the pandemic, those were reintroduced, and I understand they purport to be not single-use plastic bags, but the plastic bags are still now back in the grocery stores. Is there any thought given to going back to the idea that people bring in their own reusable bags?
Yeah. Let me say a couple of things. First of all, and maybe Tina can comment more on this too. I will say that when you talk to people in the recycling industry and the waste collection, and also just the waste management people, they have seen a discernible drop in plastic bag waste and pollution. And we've also seen a discernible drop in plastic bags showing up on the coast and in rivers at beach cleanups and that kind of thing. So to that extent, there's been some discernible success associated with our plastic bag policy. But you're absolutely right. And the sad truth here, Deb, is that the retailers, the grocers, have been oftentimes pocketing this extra 10 cents that they charge everybody for these more hefty bags, And it's very unclear where, I mean, it's supposed to be that that money was going to go to help to pay for recycling infrastructure. And most of them never allow you to bring back the bags in actuality. So I've been having some conversations about that. And you know, Tina, we should circle up on that one. Actually, there's some people I want to chat with about holding them more accountable. But anyway, Tina, I know you had some thoughts on this issue. Why don't you jump in?
Well, the only thing that I would add to that is that they will be required to be recyclable under SB54 since they're considered packaging. So those big thick plastic bags that were, once again allowed under the pandemic, now you have to charge, the grocers have to charge 10 cents for them again, but we see their use increasing even post-pandemic. Those will need to be collected and recycled by the producers in order to remain legal in California. And it'll be interesting to see if they can actually meet that criteria. I'm not sure they can.
Yeah, so we're actually holding them. They're actually going to be held accountable to their promises of collection and recycling. So it's good.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ben. This was just a wonderfully informative session, and we so appreciate the work. I hope everybody here, I'm sure everyone in this room really understands how hard you had to work to achieve this legislation. And as a thank you, Ben, we'd like to give you an honorary membership in the Renaissance Society.
Thank you.
Also make a contribution in your name.
Oh, thank you.
Seth Nelson Emergency Grant Fund. So, and Jim and I have a present for you. It's finally, you're getting a copy of Mark Eric's The Dreamt Land. So,
oh, how cool. Thank you.